It was April 1945. The world was on fire, and the Third Reich was collapsing. Across the battered landscape of Central Europe, armies surged and retreated, cities fell, and millions of lives hung in the balance. But amid the thunder of artillery and the roar of tanks, there was a silence broken only by the desperate whispers of those forgotten by history. This is the story of 200 German women nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, and civilians who found themselves trapped in a sealed boxcar, abandoned on a railway siding, starving and dying. As the war's final days ground on, for 12 days, they endured a nightmare few could imagine. And when the door finally opened, what the American soldiers found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But to understand how these women came to be prisoners of war, locked away and left to fate, we must first step back into the chaos of a dying regime and the desperate measures taken as the Allies closed in by the spring of 1945. The Eastern Front was a wasteland. The Red Army had smashed through German lines, overrunning East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. Refugees clogged the roads, civilians, wounded soldiers, and support personnel, all fleeing westward in the hope of surrendering to the Americans or British, rather than the Soviets. Among them were thousands of women who had served the German war effort. Some were members of the Wehrmacht's auxiliary services, the Helferinnen trained as radio operators, typists, and nurses. Others were Red Cross volunteers, or civilian workers conscripted to support the military machine. Many had never seen combat, but all were now swept up in the chaos of defeat as Soviet forces advanced. German command ordered mass evacuations. Trains became lifelines crammed with the wounded, the elderly, and the young, all desperate to escape the oncoming storm. But the railways were in shambles. Bridges were bombed, tracks torn up, and locomotives commandeered for military use. In the confusion, entire trains vanished, their passengers lost to history. In early April, a group of approximately 200 German women, most of them auxiliary nurses and clerks, were rounded up near the city of Leipzig. Their orders were simple: board a train heading west, away from the front. Some carried only the clothes on their backs. Others clutched small suitcases, photographs, or letters from home. Few understood what awaited them. The train was a ragged collection of boxcars, hastily assembled and overcrowded. There were no seats, no bedding, and little food. The guards, young, exhausted, and fearful, herded the women aboard, then locked the doors from the outside. For many, it was the last time they would see daylight for nearly 2 weeks. As the train lurched westward, the women huddled together for warmth. The air inside the boxcar was thick and stale. There was no ventilation, and only a single bucket for sanitation. The first hours passed in anxious silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional sob. The train moved slowly, stopping frequently as Allied air raids targeted the rail lines. Sometimes it sat motionless for hours, or even days, as engineers waited for the all clear. Food and water were scarce. The guards, themselves hungry and terrified, offered little comfort. Some women shared what little they had: crusts of bread, a few apples, a canteen of water. But as the days dragged on, supplies dwindled. On the third day, the train ground to a halt near a small village. The guards, fearing capture by advancing American forces, abandoned their posts. They locked the boxcar doors and vanished into the countryside, leaving the women trapped inside. Panic set in. The women pounded on the walls, shouted for help, and tried to pry open the doors. But the boxcar was solid, its iron fittings rusted and unyielding. The only light came from a narrow crack near the roof, through which a thin shaft of sunlight pierced a gloom dot. As the hours turned to days, hope faded. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Thirst burned their throats. Some women prayed, others wept. A few tried to keep spirits up, telling stories or singing softly in the darkness. But as the days passed, exhaustion and despair took hold. Outside, the war raged on. American tanks rolled through shattered villages. Columns of refugees trudged westward, their faces gaunt and hot. But the boxcar, sitting on a forgotten siding, was invisible, a silent tomb, sealed against the world. Inside, the women clung to life. Some scratched messages into the wooden walls, hoping someone might one day find them. Others rationed the last drops of water, passing the canteen from hand to trembling hand. The air grew fetid, heavy with the stench of sweat and fear. By the 10th day, several women had collapsed. Delirium set in. Hallucinations flickered in the darkness. The strongest tried to care for the weakest, but there was little anyone could do. Death became a constant companion, lurking in the shadows. But fate, in the form of a passing American patrol, was about to intervene. What happened next would test the limits of human endurance and reveal the quiet heroism of those who refused to let the forgotten die. The 11th day dawned gray and cold. The world outside the boxcar was eerily quiet, the distant thunder of artillery replaced by the occasional crackle of small arms fire. Inside, the women drifted between sleep and waking, their bodies weakened, their minds clouded by hunger and thirst. Some had stopped moving altogether, their breathing shallow, their eyes unfocused. The air was thick with desperation, but on that morning, a faint vibration ran through the rails, a subtle tremor that only the most alert among them noticed. It was the sound of engines, the low growl of armored vehicles moving cautiously through the countryside. For the first time in days, hope flickered. The 69th Infantry Division, part of the U.S. First Army, was advancing rapidly through Saxony. Their orders were clear: secure the area, disarm any remaining German forces, and search for prisoners of war. The men were tired, their uniforms stained with mud and sweat, but their spirits were high. The end of the war was in sight. On the morning of April 19th, a small patrol led by Lieutenant James McAllister was dispatched to investigate reports of abandoned German equipment near a railway siding outside the village of Warzon. The patrol consisted of 2 jeeps, a half-track, and a handful of infantrymen. They expected to find little more than wrecked vehicles and discarded supplies. As they approached the siding, the Americans noticed something odd: a line of boxcars, battered and rusted, sitting motionless on the tracks. The area was deserted, the only sound the distant caw of crows. But as they drew closer, one of the soldiers, Private Harold Stein, thought he heard something, a faint tapping, almost imperceptible, coming from inside one of the cars. The patrol halted. Weapons at the ready, the men approached the boxcar. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then a weak voice, hoarse, barely audible, called out in German, "Hilf, bitte Hilf." Lieutenant McAllister ordered his men to pry open the door. It was jammed, the metal warped and rusted from years of use. The soldiers worked quickly, using crowbars and rifle butts to force the lock. It took several minutes, but finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the door slid open. The interior of the boxcar was dark, the only light coming from the open door. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of sweat, urine, and the unmistakable odor of death. Dozens of women lay sprawled on the floor, their faces gaunt, their eyes sunken. Some tried to shield their eyes from the sudden light. Others did not move at all. Private Stein himself, the son of German immigrants, was the first to step inside. He called out in halting German, asking if anyone could hear him. A few women stirred, reaching weakly toward the open door. One, a nurse named Erika Bauer, managed to whisper, "Wasser, bitte Wasser." The end of the war was in sight. On the morning of April 19th, a small patrol, led by Lieutenant James McAllister, was dispatched to investigate reports of abandoned German equipment near a railway siding outside the village of Warzon. The patrol consisted of 2 jeeps, a half-track, and a handful of infantrymen. They expected to find little more than wrecked vehicles and discarded supplies. As they approached the siding, the Americans noticed something odd: a line of boxcars, battered and rusted, sitting motionless on the tracks. The area was deserted, the only sound the distant caw of crows. But as they drew closer, one of the soldiers, Private Harold Stein, thought he heard something, a faint tapping, almost imperceptible, coming from inside one of the cars. The patrol halted. Weapons at the ready, the men approached the boxcar. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Then a weak voice, hoarse, barely audible, called out in German, "Hilf, bitte Hilf." Lieutenant McAllister ordered his men to pry open the door. It was jammed, the metal warped and rusted from years of use. The soldiers worked quickly, using crowbars and rifle butts to force the lock. It took several minutes, but finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the door slid open. The interior of the boxcar was dark, the only light coming from the open door. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of sweat, urine, and the unmistakable odor of death. Dozens of women lay sprawled on the floor, their faces gaunt, their eyes sunken. Some tried to shield their eyes from the sudden light. Others did not move at all. Private Stein, himself the son of German immigrants, was the first to step inside. He called out in halting German, asking if anyone could hear him. A few women stirred, reaching weakly toward the open door. One, a nurse named Erika Bauer, managed to whisper, "Wasser." Bit, Wasser. The Americans moved quickly. Canteens were passed forward, water poured carefully into trembling hands. Some of the women drank greedily, others could barely swallow. The soldiers worked methodically, lifting the weakest out of the car and laying them gently on the grass outside. Medics were summoned, and field rations distributed as the women were carried from the boxcar. The full extent of their ordeal became clear. Of the original 200, nearly a dozen had died during the 12 days of confinement. Several more were unconscious, their bodies ravaged by dehydration and starvation. The survivors were emaciated, their skins stretched tight over bone, their hair matted and filthy. Lieutenant McAllister radioed for assistance. Within an hour, more medics arrived, bringing blankets, food, and medical supplies. The women were triaged. Those in the worst condition were given priority, while others were treated for shock, exposure, and minor injuries. For many of the American soldiers, the scene was a sobering reminder of the war's true cost. They had seen death before on the battlefield, in the ruins of bombed-out cities, but this was different. These were not enemy combatants, but women, some barely out of their teens, who had been abandoned by their own side, left to die in a forgotten boxcar. As the medics worked, Lieutenant McAllister sat with Erika Bauer, the nurse who had first spoken to them. Through tears, she recounted their ordeal, the forced evacuation, the days without food or water, the terror of being locked away and forgotten. She spoke of the women who had died and those who had tried to keep hope alive. Her words were halting, her voice barely above a whisper, but her gratitude was unmistakable. "We thought we would never see the sun again," she said. "We thought we would die in the dark." The Americans listened in silence, their faces grim. They had come expecting to find enemy soldiers, perhaps a few prisoners. Instead, they had uncovered a tragedy, a testament to the chaos and cruelty of war. But the story did not end with the opening of the boxcar. For the survivors, the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. And for the American soldiers, the discovery would raise difficult questions about mercy, justice, and the true meaning of victory. The railway siding outside Wurzen became, for a brief moment, a place of reckoning, a crossroads where the horrors of war collided with the fragile hope of survival. As the American medics worked, the women who could walk huddled together in the spring sunlight, blinking at the world they had nearly left behind. Some wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process the ordeal they had endured. The first priority was triage. Captain Robert Hensley, the division's senior medic, quickly assessed the survivors. Severe dehydration, acute malnutrition, and shock were rampant. Several women were in critical condition, their pulses weak, their skin cold and clammy. The medics administered water in small sips, careful not to overwhelm fragile systems. They distributed rations, biscuits, cheese, chocolate, and powdered milk measured out in tiny portions to avoid refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal complication for the starved. Blankets were wrapped around shivering bodies. The medics checked for signs of infection, frostbite, and wounds. Some women had pressure sores from lying on the hard floor for days. Others bore the marks of desperation, scratches on their arms, bruises from trying to force open the door, and the haunted look of those who had seen death up close. The Americans set up a makeshift aid station beside the tracks. They radioed for ambulances and additional supplies. Within hours, a convoy of Red Cross vehicles arrived, bringing more food, water, and medical staff. The women were loaded onto stretchers and carried to the waiting trucks. Their journey from darkness to daylight finally underway. As the survivors were evacuated, the Americans took stock of the boxcar. Inside, The air was still heavy with the stench of suffering. The bodies of the dead were carefully removed, wrapped in blankets, and laid side by side on the grass. Lieutenant McAllister ordered a detail to dig graves nearby, and the fallen were buried with quiet dignity. A chaplain read a brief prayer, and the soldiers stood in silent tribute. For the survivors, the physical wounds would heal with time, but the psychological scars ran deeper. Many suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt. Some could not speak of what had happened, while others recounted every detail, as if by telling their story they could make sense of the senseless. Erica Bauer, the nurse who had first called out to the Americans, became a voice for the group. She spoke of the women who had died, naming them, remembering their kindness, their courage, their final words. She insisted that their story be told, not as a tale of victory, but as a testament to endurance and the will to survive. For the men of the 69th Infantry Division, the discovery of the Boxcar was a sobering experience. Many had seen combat, had lost friends and comrades in the fighting, but this was different. This was suffering without reason, cruelty without purpose. It was a reminder that war was not just a contest of armies, but a crucible that tested the limits of humanity. Private Harold Stein, whose German heritage had allowed him to communicate with the women, wrote home about the experience. "We found them half dead," he told his parents. "They were just girls, most of them, nurses, secretaries. They had nothing to do with the fighting. I don't know how anyone could do this to another human being." The story spread quickly through the division. Some soldiers were angry, others simply numb. A few questioned why they should care for enemy nationals, but most recognized the simple truth: suffering knows no uniform. The women were victims of circumstance, caught in the machinery of a war that had long since lost its sense of purpose. The survivors were taken to a field hospital outside Leipzig, where they received further treatment. Doctors monitored their vital signs, administered intravenous fluids, and began the slow process of reintroducing food. Psychologists and chaplains offered counseling, though for many, the trauma was too fresh to confront. Over the following weeks, the women regained their strength. Some wrote letters home, uncertain if their families were still alive. Others volunteered to help in the hospital, caring for wounded soldiers, American and German alike. Bonds formed between the former prisoners and their rescuers, forged in the crucible of shared suffering. The American command documented the incident, filing reports with the Red Cross and the Allied military government. The story was passed up the chain of command, eventually reaching the desks of generals and politicians. For a brief moment, the plight of the forgotten women became a symbol of the war's human cost, a reminder that victory was measured not just in territory gained, but in lives saved. But as the world celebrated the end of the war, the memory of the Boxcar faded into the background. The survivors returned to a shattered Germany, their story nearly lost amid the ruins. Yet for those who lived through it and those who opened the door, the lessons of that day would never be forgotten. The war in Europe ended just weeks after the Boxcar was opened. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent, and the world exhaled. But for the 200 women who had survived 12 days in darkness, the end of the war was only the beginning of a new struggle, a struggle to reclaim their lives, to find meaning in survival, and to ensure that what happened in that Boxcar would not be forgotten. The survivors were eventually repatriated to Germany, a country in ruins. Cities lay in rubble, families were scattered, and the future was uncertain. Some returned to homes that no longer existed. Others searched for loved ones lost in the chaos. The trauma of the Boxcar lingered, a shadow that followed them through the years. For many, the experience became a defining moment. Erica Bauer, the nurse whose voice had first reached the Americans, dedicated her life to helping others. She worked in hospitals, cared for orphans, and spoke to anyone who would listen about the horrors of war and the importance of compassion. Her story, and the stories of the other women, became part of a larger narrative, a testament to endurance, to the will to survive, and to the quiet heroism that often goes unrecognized. For the men of the 69th Infantry Division, the memory of the Boxcar never faded. Lieutenant McAllister, Private Stein, and the others who had opened the door carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it often, using it as a lesson in empathy and the responsibilities of power. Others kept it to themselves, haunted by the faces they had seen in the darkness. In the years that followed, reunions were held, letters exchanged, and memories shared. The story of the Boxcar became a touchstone, a reminder of the best and worst of humanity, and of the thin line that separates hope from despair. For decades, the story of the 200 women in the Boxcar was little known outside the circles of those who had lived it. The official reports were filed away, the graves marked only by simple crosses. In the rush to rebuild, to move forward, the world had little time for stories of suffering and survival. But history has a way of resurfacing. In the 1980s, a German historian researching the fate of displaced persons during the war stumbled upon the records of the Boxcar. Interviews were conducted, survivors tracked down, and the story began to emerge from the shadows. Documentaries were made, articles published, and the memory of those 12 days was preserved for future generations. The story of the Boxcar is not just a tale of suffering. It is a story of choices of the guards who abandoned their charges, of the women who refused to give up, and of the soldiers who chose compassion over indifference. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is room for humanity. For military historians, the incident is a case study in the chaos of retreat, the breakdown of command, and the unintended consequences of war. For veterans, it is a reminder of the bonds that form in adversity, and of the duty to protect the vulnerable, regardless of nationality or allegiance. But for all of us, it is a call to remember not just the battles and the victories, but the lives caught in the crossfire, the stories that might otherwise be lost. Today, the railway siding outside Wurzen is quiet. The tracks are overgrown, the boxcars long since scrapped. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes, the desperate tapping on the walls, the whispered prayers, the cry for water that pierced the silence. A small plaque marks the site, placed there by local historians and the families of survivors. It bears a simple inscription, in memory of those who suffered here, and of those who answered their call. The story of the 200 German women POWs, who starved for 12 days in a boxcar, is a story of suffering, yes, but also of survival, of rescue, and of the enduring power of compassion. It is a story that reminds us, even in the darkest hours, that the door can be opened, and that hope can survive. As we look back on the events of April 1945, we are reminded that history is not just a record of battles and leaders, but of ordinary people, nurses, soldiers, refugees caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their stories matter. Their voices deserve to be heard. The boxcar at Wurzen stands as a symbol not just of what was endured, but of what was overcome. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and to the simple, profound truth that even in war, mercy is possible. And so, as we remember the 200 women who survived those 12 days, and the Americans who opened the door, we honor not just their suffering, but their courage, the courage to endure, to hope, and to reach out, even in the darkest of times.